Today, I want to talk budget paddles. How's it going, everyone? I'm Rafa, the Pickleball Tech Dude. I'm an ex-PPA employee, a Harvard-educated engineer, and a seasoned pickleball product tester. And the question I've probably been getting asked more than any other recently, other than what are the best power paddles on the market, which, don't worry, video coming soon, is what are the best paddles for beginners? Combining that with the fact that I'm a big proponent of future-proofing, the idea that you buy a product that you'll want to keep even in the future when newer products come out, I want to talk about the budget paddles I've played with over the last couple of years that I legitimately would or already have taken into competitive tournament play. For a paddle to be contention to be in this video, it only had to meet two requirements. Firstly, it had to be $120 or less, as you'll find that the average competitive paddle costs around $160 to $170, so $120 represents a 25% decrease roughly from that average. And secondly, it could not be one of those $30 to $40 Amazon, Walmart, Target, or Dick's Sporting Goods paddles. I'm simply never going to recommend one of those paddles because, first and foremost, unless you're playing against other people using the same paddles, you will not remain competitive in a game nowadays. And secondly, they're simply not durable enough. Even though these budget paddles I'm talking about might be 2 or 3 times as expensive, I'm confident in saying that they will last you more than 2 or 3 times the play time as those paddles would. So taking all this into account, I spent the last several days poring over my notes and all my footage of the many budget paddles I've tested over the last 2 years. And I finally settled on a top 5 that I would 100% take into tournament play. So let's talk about them. Actually, before I get into that top 5, I'd like to give a shout out to my honorable mentions from the list, the Baller Pro and the Neonic Flare Prime 14mm. The Baller Pro is the only paddle of all the paddles I'm talking about today that has an extended 6-inch handle length. If you needed a paddle that had comfortable room for 2 hands and also really facilitated a soft game and resets from the midcourt, then the Baller Pro is probably the only paddle that I would recommend. What holds the Baller Pro back for me is the stitched grip, the slow hand speed, and the fact that the sweet spot is a pretty good size, but it's not very forgiving. When it comes to the Neonic Flare Prime, this paddle could have easily made the top 5. The Flare Prime does a really good job, in my opinion, of taking the major drawback of a 14mm paddle, being the super small, unforgiving sweet spot, and instead create an extended handle standard shape paddle that, while the sweet spot is still not too forgiving, is much more consistent. Now, the reason the Flare Prime doesn't make the top 5 for me is because it was actually intended to be released alongside the Flare Titanium, which I actually had pretty high opinions of. And the reason it wasn't is because the first batch of these paddles actually came with less foam than Neonic intended, and therefore they've made the decision to discontinue this paddle once their first batch of it completely sells out at this price point. So the only reason it's still here is because I actually think this paddle had some pretty good promise, as I still thought it played pretty well despite knowing that the foam would have probably added some more pop and power. So I'm hoping that Neonic will correct the construction and bring it back in the near future. Alright, and so with that, let's kick off these top 5 paddles. Starting off with the paddle at the number 5 spot, the Triple J Pickleball Judge 16mm. Now, the reason the Judge breaks into my top 5 is because along with a sweet spot that is pretty forgiving and gives you a ball feel experience that's very reminiscent of much higher price paddles out there, it also maintains a relatively low balance point even though it has an elongated shape with a longer face, meaning that you still get a pretty good level of hand speed that's very usable in tournament play. Now, the main thing that's probably keeping the Judge from being higher up on this list is that the spin numbers are simply not there from what we're expecting from high-performing paddles. But if that's a non-issue for you, and not to take away from Thrive Pickleball's process of being able to customize swing and static weight, which is truly unique in the industry and I think makes them a fantastic customer service company, however, if that isn't quite that important to you either, then from my playing experience, the Triple J Judge is essentially a budget Thrive Threat 16mm with less grit. So take that for what it's worth. Next up at the number 4 spot, I have the AETHOS Pickleball M1 Legion. I don't think it's far-fetched to say that despite only having this one paddle, when you combine that with the community impact and the sponsorship that AETHOS does locally, it's definitely in the conversation for top 3 Canadian pickleball companies out there right now. If you're curious, I still think Grooven takes the cake there. That Laser 16 series is something for sure, but that's for a separate video. Now, the M1 Legion, while being constructed very similarly to the Triple J Judge in terms of Gen 2 tech and overall shape, it offers some more colorways and a design that overall is a little bit more sleek in my opinion, and also is balanced a little bit higher in a way that really well aligns with the sweet spot area, meaning that on drives, you really feel that plow through the ball that gives you a lot more power. Now, if you follow me on Instagram, which if you don't, you definitely should because I post a lot of updates while testing over there, you'll notice that the last picture in which I have medals is from a season format competitive play I did at a 4.0 plus level months and months and months ago. But during that season, all I used almost exclusively was the M1 Legion. What holds the Legion back most for me is that eventually if you plan on developing a two-handed backhand, the lack of room there really begins to show after a certain point. And also, similar to the Triple J Judge, the spin numbers simply aren't there from what we were expecting. However, you do need to take into account that this paddle came out months and months and months ago before companies were putting absolutely insane grit on paddles. Awesome, so now we're finally getting into the top 3. And for me, starting off at number 3 comes a relatively new company on the scene in BEATNIK Pickleball with their HYPERBEAT series. Now, the BEATNIK HYPERBEAT series was actually mentioned in Glamour magazine as a top 10 pickleball paddle on the market. And not many of you will know or even care about Glamour magazine's opinion, but this is probably the one paddle on that list that I might actually agree with. Not in terms of it being a top 10 paddle on the market, but clearly it's a top 10, and in my case, a top 5 budget paddle out there right now. What's interesting about the HYPERBEAT series is that while the ball feel experience is definitely a little bit more on the rigid side, which would normally indicate a sweet spot that is more unforgiving towards the edges, the sweet spot goes so far out towards the edges that on 99% of shots, you're really not going to hit close enough to the edge wall to really feel that unforgiving nature, and that is a great problem to have. The HYPERBEAT paddles do a really good job at maintaining a decent balance point that gives you pretty average hand speed, which is better than the previous paddles that I've mentioned, and they also have top 3 levels of spin in terms of this entire paddle list. Now, for me, the 2 characteristics that keep BEATNIK the most from making it to a top 2 or top pick on this paddle list overall is firstly the stitched grip, which I normally wouldn't mention because you can remove stock grips, but I feel like if you're looking for a budget paddle, you're probably not looking to spend extra money on modifications like overgrips. And secondly, it's the design. For me, I personally love poppy, colorful designs, but I know for a lot of people, you're looking for something a little bit more toned down and sleek, which this obviously is not that. All right, so finally getting to the silver medal position, and if you watch a lot of paddle reviews, it's not going to surprise you at all that the paddle makes it this far up the list. We have the VATIC Pickleball PRISM Flash series. The PRISM Flash series contains 2 different paddle shapes, 2 different handle lengths, including a longer handle version for two-handed backhands, and a consistent hitting area that always feels reinforced on every inch of the paddle face. A lot of people would probably put these paddles in at number 1, but for me, the main reason it doesn't get up there for me is that firstly, the grit tends to wear a little bit faster, even though it is raw carbon fiber in comparison to other paddles. Again, taking into account that these paddles came out months and months and months ago before companies were putting crazy grit on paddles to prevent that. And also, these paddles are just so soft and control oriented. So in my opinion, if you want any power at all or need that in your game, then the PRISM Flashes are simply not it for you. And finally, we've made it to the summit. So, drumroll please. The top budget paddle that I personally would take to a tournament is a tie. And it's a tie between the SPARTUS Apollo and the 11624 MONARCH JELLYBEAN 16mm. Okay, I know that definitely seems like cheating, but the reason I made this decision is because both of these paddles stand out in terms of performance so far above pretty much everything else that I've mentioned today, and each one has characteristics that the other one doesn't necessarily have, so it felt right to just put them both up at the top together. Let me explain further by starting with the SPARTUS Apollo. While I don't really like the super short handle that's not conducive to two-handed backhands, and the shape overall is definitely very pizza pan / phallic in nature, The overall performance of the Apollo is quite outstanding. It has 95th percentile spin, not just of budget paddles, but every single paddle I've ever tested. It has a sweet spot that is very consistent and forgiving, although it does have its limitations going towards the edge of the wide body shape. It has super, super low swing weight, meaning that it feels very quick to swing in the hands. And it also plays very soft with not a lot of added power, but with really high degrees of control over ball placement. And so with that, you can probably tell what the 11624 Monarch Jellybean is already good at. The Monarch Jellybean has a much longer handle, very conducive to two-handed shots. It has a shape that is a lot more reminiscent of a traditional paddle shape and also uses a raw carbon fiber phase as opposed to Kevlar. It has a sweet spot and ball feel that is much more rigid, but goes wall to wall, so you don't have to worry about any forgiveness there. It doesn't have too much to offer in terms of spin, although it is much improved in comparison to previous 11624 drops. And in terms of power, the reinforcement behind the hard shots like drives feels so much more present than it does on the Apollo. So here you can see we have two different wide bodies in two different categories of performance style, but feel extremely premium and usable at a super high competitive level for two very different reasons. And so there you have it, a complete guide to, in my opinion, the best budget paddles on the market, or at least the ones that I would take into competitive play. I don't think the ball feel and play experience gets any better in the budget category right now than the SPARTUS Apollo, and I don't think you get a more consistent, all-court, almost leaning power paddle performance out of any budget paddle than you can out of the Monarch Jellybean. But I really do think that you can't go wrong with any of the paddles that I've mentioned today. They all just play super well and will give you that bang for your buck that you're looking for. I'm going to use this video as a basis for my budget paddle reviews moving through the end of the year, as I'm definitely keeping my mind open to future drops to make it onto the list. So we'll see if there's going to be a need for an update video in the future. But if you made it here to the end of the video, thank you so much as usual for watching and for your support. Remember to like and subscribe for more reviews and just more content in general related to the pickleball industry. And I hope you all stay happy and healthy and out on the courts until the next one. Peace.